Asim Haque is Senior Vice President of Government and Member Services at PJM Interconnection. In January, PJM agreed to a price cap for its upcoming 2026-27 capacity auction. Can you explain the background of that and what that means?
Yeah, absolutely. So our capacity auction is one of a few different auctions that we run here at PJM, and we do a lot more than just run auctions here at PJM, and hopefully we'll get a chance to talk about that. But our capacity auction in particular is meant to procure enough resources for an out year. And so with respect to this particular settlement that we entered into with Governor Shapiro, and it's a settlement in principle, it still has to be approved by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, we agreed to a particular price cap at $325 a megawatt day and a price floor of $175 a megawatt day for the upcoming two auctions, which are auctions that will affect pricing in the mid-26 to mid-27 range and the mid-27 range to mid-28 range. And we entered into that settlement, first of all, our priorities in making sure that we found an outcome that was suitable was, first of all, the pricing needs to be able to continue to incent new resource entry onto the system. PJM, we've got to keep the lights on here, and we do it for 65 million consumers in the footprint, and we do it very, very well. And so we needed to make sure that whatever outcome that we had here would continue to directionally incentivize new entry and would be an investable outcome for our market participants. Now, certainly the Shapiro administration's concerns were around consumer costs. We also share that concern around consumer costs. I think we were able to kind of find the intersection of the Venn diagram here to land in a place that was ultimately acceptable to PJM and also acceptable to the Shapiro administration.
What's the time frame for these auctions? Once the auction is held and the price is met, how many years out ahead of that is that valid for?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so historically, we would hold these auctions and they would procure for a period that was 3 years into the future. So for instance, typically, if we were to hold an auction in, say, May of 2025, we'd be procuring out for effectively 2028 to 2029. However, we've had some delays in these auctions to try and accommodate particular rule changes to these auctions. We're also regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission, who kind of dictates when some of these market reforms go into place. So we're a little behind in those auctions right now, but specifically to the cap and floor auctions that were settled upon, we're looking at the mid-26 to mid-27 and mid-27 to mid-28 timeframes.
Now, the auction that was held last summer resulted in prices that were over 800% increase from the prior year. What were the reasons for that increase?
Yeah, it's really a function of supply and demand. And so on our system, we are seeing supply decreasing primarily due to policy efforts and demand increasing primarily due to the proliferation of data centers in our footprint, which is 13 states in the District of Columbia. And so these supply demand fundamentals, really supply contracting and demand increasing, are really creating this uptick in pricing for consumers and for businesses.
When can consumers expect to feel those price increases?
Yeah, for this last auction, they'll expect to feel those price increases in June. But I do want to make one particular note, which is that this auction, the capacity auction, it is one component of your bill. What do I mean by that? Your typical bill as a consumer is comprised of really three buckets. It's your generation, your transmission, and your distribution. Those are the three primary functions of the electricity, both generation all the way through to delivery sort of chain. And so the capacity pricing, while it went up, I think you utilized the figure 800%. That doesn't mean there will be an 800% jump in your bills or even an 800% jump in that component of your bill. It is a component of the generation component of your total bill that will result in, that ultimately will be increased as these supply demand fundamentals continue to be challenged.
Now, you mentioned that one of the results of these auctions is incentivizing new generation elements coming onto the system. How does that process work, and how long does it take for new sources of energy generation to come on?
Yeah, it's a great question. So we have what's called a generation interconnection queue. And resources that want to plug into the grid, well, they can't just plug in. They have to be electrically studied. The grid is a machine. It's governed by the laws of physics. It's governed by laws associated with the discipline of engineering. We've got to make sure that when you plug into the grid, you're doing it electrically, reliably, and safely. And so you go through what is effectively an intensive study process by our engineers here at PJM to make sure that you can plug into the grid. We have undertaken reform of that process. That reform was necessary because we moved from a system where we had a bunch of large centralized generating stations trying to plug into the grid to a system where we've got a lot of smaller, primarily renewable projects wanting to plug into the grid. So we went to our regulator, we got the blessing of our regulator for reforming that process. So starting in 2026, we're still sort of in the reformation process right now. Starting in 2026, we will be in a 1 to 2 year turnaround time frame for any projects that have entered the queue. Right now, we'll characterize it as a transition period as we transition to that new process.
Are there any policies that PJM would like to see implemented to make that process smoother?
I think we are pretty well comfortable with the direction that's been given to us by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to reform that process. But we are seeking from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission a few additional processes to try and expedite resources to find their way onto the grid. You know, we've got to do everything in our power to try and alleviate some of these supply demand concerns. So we went to the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission actually towards the end of last year to get a few additional opportunities to more quickly connect resources to the system done. One of those involves this concept called surplus interconnection, where effectively, primarily if you're a renewable resource and you may not be generating at your absolute capacity all day because you might be a solar resource that can only generate when the sun is shining. You might be a wind resource that's only generating when the wind is blowing. We want to provide the opportunity to actually have what is likely a battery find its way onto that site and plug into the grid relatively quickly, relatively seamlessly, outside of the current interconnection queue. We've also requested of the FERC the opportunity to to open up another, we'll characterize it as a queue lane on the highway to let our resources that are more shovel-ready, that'll best contribute to reliability, to find their way onto the grid quickly. And that's an initiative that we call the Reliability Resource Initiative, and so on and so forth. There's a few other efforts that we have undertaken, but again, we're doing everything in our power to try and ensure that we are getting as much supply on the system as quickly as possible to try and alleviate these supply-demand challenges.
Now, you mentioned before the impact of artificial intelligence data centers. Can you give people a sense of how much energy these are using?
Yeah, a lot of energy. And I would say sometimes the amount of energy of, small to mid-sized cities. These are consumers that need to be running 24/7 and need a lot of power to run. And so, we welcome the opportunity to have data centers find their way to the footprint. I know that our states and local jurisdictions welcome the opportunity to have them locate in their jurisdictions for purposes of economic development. We are doing our absolute best, though, to figure out ways to make sure that when they come on the system, we're able to serve them, but also simultaneously, serve our residential and our existing business consumers as well. It's quite the challenge, but we are taking affirmative steps to try and make sure that they can connect and they can connect without reliability issues.
You also mentioned the transition from bigger power sources to some of the smaller renewable sources. Talk more about that. We're looking at a lot of coal-fired power plants. When they're retired, are they being replaced by equivalent amount of energy producers?
Yeah, we are certainly in what we characterize as an energy transition, as we see a lot of our we characterize them as thermal resources, coal, gas, and nuclear. We're seeing a lot of coal, especially, leave the system, again, primarily due to a combination of environmental policy considerations, as well as, a lot of our coal fleet is aging, and some of them are leaving for economic purposes as well. A lot of policy, some economic on the coal side. We do have quite a bit of renewable power that is trying to find its way onto the system. We welcome those resources finding their way to the system. Just a couple of notes, generally speaking, they're smaller in wattage, smaller in megawatts than the resources leaving the system. So you need, a greater number of them to make up for the resource leaving the system, number one. Number two, they do not have the same operational characteristics as the resources leaving the system. So the obvious thing is, if you're a solar resource and it's dark out, you're not going to be able to generate. If you're a wind resource and the wind isn't blowing, you're not going to be able to generate. And so we ascribe what is effectively a value or a reliability value to each class of resources. And the reliability value, for instance, a coal resource that's leaving the system is quite a bit higher than a solar, certainly a solar resource that's finding its way into the system. Wind is characterized as a bit higher in terms of its reliability value. So it's just something to be aware of, I would say, as a consumer, as a policymaker, that not all of these resources are the same. They have their own operational characteristics. They have their own contributions to reliability, especially during the riskiest hours of the riskiest days for PJM.
What are some of the challenges of maintaining a consistent energy generation during extreme weather events?
Yeah, so, depending on the fuel type, you could have specific challenges, for instance, for natural gas resources about gas availability. You could have challenges related to the the freezing of particular equipment. I think for every resource in our footprint, we have concerns around freezing issues related to equipment. We had a really challenging event a few years back. It was actually Winter Storm Elliott, where we had quite a bit of generation where inside the fence line of those generators, there was quite a bit of freeze that prevented those generators from operating appropriately. Our riskiest times we have found now are during the winter. And what we try and make sure to do is provide the right incentives and even penalties to those generators to make sure that they are winterizing and that they are ready to go for when we need them the most. Again, during winter, and really, really cold winter days have become our riskiest hours of our riskiest days.
How significant is Pennsylvania as an energy exporter?
It is the largest exporter of the 13 states plus the District of Columbia that we have. Pennsylvania is, generally speaking, an energy powerhouse. It's a state that has a significant amount of, we'll characterize it again as our base load or thermal resources of coal, gas, and nuclear. About half of the state right now's capacity is natural gas. A good chunk of that remaining capacity is nuclear. You do have coal, though coal is on the decline, and you've got a growing renewable solar, wind, and storage portfolio as well. And so you've got a really great situation here if you're a resident of the Commonwealth, where you've got this, really residing in an energy powerhouse. That's good for local economies, because if you're exporting power, if you live in a jurisdiction where you've got a power plant or you've got a resource that wants to find its way to the jurisdiction, it's good for economic development purposes that way. It's good for economic development purposes for businesses that want to locate in jurisdictions where they know they'll have ample power supply. I think that is also, a real incentive here. The ability to export just means that effectively those generators are making revenue for not only supplying PA consumers, but other consumers. Again, good for those businesses, good for localities.
Can you talk about PJM as a regional transmission organization?
Yeah, sure. So, we are certainly not a household name, but, we are an organization that, really, again, has this concept of reliability, kind of tattooed on our hearts. There are 9 of us in North America. We are a regional grid operator that is fully regulated by the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission. We effectively operate as a nonprofit, and really our primary sort of proposition or value proposition to consumers is being the air traffic controller of electrons. We make sure that we match supply and demand in real time. We make sure that watts get generated and transmitted over a high voltage transmission system and get to a distribution substation where it's taken by whoever your local utility is. PECO, the PPL utility, Duquesne, First Energy, and delivered to homes and businesses in the Commonwealth. And so, this sort of effort of being the air traffic controller, on a day-to-day basis is, again, an effort that we take very seriously, highly trained individuals that work in our control room setting who are overseeing this function, where it gets really, really, again, mission critical is when we have inclement weather days and we're trying to make sure that we are meeting the needs of consumers across our 13 states and the District of Columbia. Again, think of us if the 3 components of the bill that I had mentioned, generation, transmission, distribution. Think of us on the generation and transmission side. We don't own any assets, but effectively are given the authority by the federal government to ensure that those assets are acting in harmony to generate and transmit the watt so that it gets to your local utility, who then delivers it to your home and business. That's the best way to think about what we do around here.
We've been speaking with Asim Haque. He's the Senior Vice President of Government and Member Services at PJM Interconnection. Asim, thank you for talking with me.
Thank you so much. It was a pleasure.